The 22nd of June 1941. The factory siren wailed, not for a shift change, but like a wounded animal. Its long cry, rolling over the rail yards, as the first radio bulletins crackled through loudspeakers, bolted to brick walls and steel columns. Inside Factory No. 183. Where the smell of oil and hot metal never truly left a man's clothes. Machinist Ivan Petrovich Sokolov froze with his hands still on the lathe. The radio voice was tight, almost brittle. German forces had crossed the border. War had come in full daylight. Outside, trains screamed as they braked, iron wheels shrieking against rails. Somewhere beyond the smokestacks, anti-aircraft crews were already dragging guns into position, though no one could yet hear engines overhead. Inside the vast assembly hall, half-built T-34 hulls sat like crouched beasts, their sloped armor catching the dim light filtering through soot-stained windows. For months, men and women had worked around the clock to perfect these machines. Now, in a single morning, everything they thought they understood about time was erased. Ivan wiped his hands on a rag and listened as foreman Mikhail Grigorievich shouted for calm. Orders came fast and half-formed. Continue work. Await instructions. The front was far away, they said, but everyone in Kharkov knew the geography. They knew the roads, the rail lines, the open plains that invited armored columns. The Germans would come for the factories. They always did. By afternoon, the first Luftwaffe reconnaissance planes were reported south of the city. The assembly hall lights flickered as power was diverted to air defenses. Outside, workers gathered in knots, speaking in low voices. Some had sons already in uniform. Others remembered the Civil War, remembered hunger and retreat. Ivan thought of his wife and their 2 children in a communal apartment not far from the plant. He also thought of the T-34 hull in front of him, unfinished, mute, waiting. That night, the order finally came, carried by a courier with dust on his boots and sweat soaking his tunic. Factory No. 183 was to prepare for evacuation. Not partial. Total. Machines, tools, blueprints, workers, everything that could be moved would go east. What could not would be destroyed. The words hung in the air like smoke. Evacuation was not a plan. It was an admission. The enemy was coming faster than anyone wanted to admit. Within days, Kharkov became a city of motion and noise. Rail yards filled with flat cars and boxcars, each one tagged in chalk, with destinations most workers had never heard spoken aloud. Sverdlovsk Oblast, Nizhny Tagil. Ivan helped unbolt his own lathe from the concrete floor, the metal screaming in protest as if it understood it was being torn from its home. Women wrapped precision instruments in rags and coats. Engineers carried rolled blueprints under their arms like children pulled from burning houses. German bombers struck the outskirts of the city before the evacuation was complete. The first explosions came just after dawn one morning, a distant thump that rolled across the factory windows. Then another. Closer. The anti-aircraft guns answered, sharp and angry. Ivan was loading crates onto a rail car when the shockwave hit, knocking him flat onto the gravel. Somewhere, glass shattered. A plume of black smoke rose beyond the yard. The Luftwaffe had found Kharkov. Trains began leaving under fire. There was no ceremony, no speeches, just whistles, shouted goodbyes, and the grinding pull of locomotives straining under impossible loads. Families were packed into wooden cars meant for freight, not people. The air inside was thick with coal, dust, and fear. Children cried until exhaustion claimed them. Old men stared at the walls, silent. Ivan's wife, Anna, held their youngest close, whispering promises she did not know how to keep. The journey east lasted weeks. The train stopped often, sometimes for hours, sometimes for days, as tracks ahead were bombed or clogged with other evacuations. At night, the cars were cold even in summer. People burned scraps of wood, broken crates, anything that would catch. They shared bread and rumors in equal measure. Kursk had fallen. No, it hadn't. Kiev was surrounded. Moscow was next. Each new story tightened the knot in Ivan's chest. When the train finally ground to a halt in the Urals, the landscape felt like another planet. Nizhny Tagil was not a city so much as a sprawl of workshops, barracks, and smoke, anchored by the Ural-Vagonzavod railcar plant. This, they were told, would be the new home of Factory No. 183. There was no time to argue. German tanks were already deep inside Soviet territory. The first nights were spent in tents and half-finished barracks. Frost came early. Tools arrived before walls did. Machines were unloaded directly into the open air, tarps thrown over them like thin blankets. Engineers marked out assembly lines on bare earth with sticks and chalk. Ivan's hands cracked and bled as he helped set his lathe again, bolting it down on a concrete slab that was still damp and freezing. There were no speeches about heroism then, only exhaustion. Only the knowledge that if they failed, there would be no replacement. The Red Army needed tanks, and the T-34 was no longer just a weapon. It was a promise that the invasion could be stopped. Somewhere far to the west, men were already dying in burning fields. Here, under the wide Ural sky, another battle was beginning, fought not with rifles, but with wrenches, hammers, and the stubborn refusal to let the machines fall silent. As Ivan lay on a wooden bunk that first night, listening to the wind claw at the thin walls, he understood that Factory No. 183 had not escaped the war at all. It had simply carried the war with it, deeper into the heart of the Soviet Union. The 15th of September, 1941. Nizhny Tagil. The first snow fell before the walls were finished, hissing as it touched hot steel, and turning instantly to gray slush under hundreds of boots. Ivan Sokolov stood ankle-deep in mud, mixed with ice, bracing a timber upright while a crane groaned overhead, its cable swaying in the wind. The crane operator shouted through cupped hands, his breath hanging white in the air. What was supposed to become the largest tank factory in the world existed only as a skeleton of beams, scattered machines, and men who no longer remembered what it felt like to be warm. Ural-Vagonzavod had been a railcar plant, never designed for the brutal pace and precision of tank production. Entire workshops were being assembled at the same time tanks were expected to roll off the line. There were no finished floors, no proper roofs. Lathes and presses sat under tarpaulins, their metal skins sweating in the cold. Power cables snaked through puddles. Sparks flew in the open air as welders worked without shelter, their faces ghostly behind darkened masks. The evacuation trains kept coming. Each brought more machines, more workers, more mouths to feed. With them came engineers from Kharkov, designers who knew the T-34 down to the last bolt, and teenagers straight out of technical schools who would soon be expected to work 12-hour shifts. Women made up nearly half the workforce now. Many had husbands at the front. Some would never hear from them again. Housing was a rumor more than a reality. Barracks went up fast and poorly, gaps stuffed with rags and newspaper. Families were crammed into single rooms, sometimes 2 or 3 families together. Ivan and Anna shared a space with another couple and their child. At night, the cold crept in through the walls and settled in their bones. They slept in coats, boots tucked under thin blankets to keep them from freezing solid. In the mornings, breath crystallized on the air, and the taste of metal seemed permanent on the tongue. Food was rationed strictly. Bread was dark and heavy, cut carefully into equal portions. Soup was thin, sometimes nothing more than hot water with floating cabbage leaves. Yet the factory canteens were always full. No one lingered. They ate standing up, swallowed quickly, and went back to work. Hunger was a constant companion, but idleness was a luxury no one could afford. Above everything hung the pressure of time. Reports from the front grew worse by the day. Kiev had fallen. German columns were racing toward Moscow. The Red Army was losing tanks faster than factories could replace them. Orders from the State Defense Committee arrived blunt and uncompromising. Production must begin immediately. Not when the factory was finished. Not when conditions improved. Immediately. The first attempt at assembly was almost farcical. Components arrived out of sequence. Engines froze overnight and had to be thawed with blowtorches. Steel cracked in the cold. Gearboxes jammed. Ivan watched as a nearly completed hull was rolled forward only to stop dead when a misaligned bearing seized. There was shouting, swearing, fists slammed against steel. No one had time for patience. Chief Engineer Alexander Alexandrovich Morozov moved through the chaos like a man possessed. His coat was always dusted with metal filings, his eyes red from lack of sleep. He argued with foremen, rewrote procedures on the fly, simplified designs wherever possible. If a part took too long to machine, it was redesigned. If a tolerance could be widened without compromising combat performance, it was widened. Perfection was a peacetime concept. Survival was not. Ivan felt the changes in his hands. The work became rougher, faster. The careful rituals he had learned in Kharkov were stripped away. Speed mattered more than elegance. A tank that ran and fired was good enough. A tank delayed was a sin. When mistakes happened, they were fixed on the spot or pushed down the line. There was no going back. By October, the Germans were at the gates of Moscow. The news spread through the factory in fragments, carried by newspapers read aloud, by whispers in the canteen. The idea that the capital might fall was almost unbearable. Some workers broke down quietly at their machines. Others worked harder, as if the motion itself could hold the enemy back. Ivan found himself speaking to the steel as he worked, urging it to behave, to hold together just long enough. The cold deepened. Temperatures dropped well below freezing inside the workshops. Oil thickened. Metal burned bare skin. Frost formed on the inside of windows and never melted. Fires were lit in barrels along the assembly lines, crude attempts to take the edge off the cold. Smoke mixed with steam and welding fumes, turning the air into a choking haze. Eyes watered constantly. Coughing became background noise. And yet, slowly, the first complete assembly line emerged, marked by chalk arrows on the floor and shouted instructions. Hulls moved forward in fits and starts. Turrets were lowered into place by cranes that groaned like exhausted animals. Engines roared to life for the first time. The sound echoing across the frozen yard and drawing cheers that died quickly as men hurried back to work. In November 1941, the first T-34 fully assembled in Nizhny Tagil stood under a thin layer of snow, its green paint still wet in places. It was not perfect. The welds were rough. The interior was cramped and unfinished in spots. But when the engine started and the tracks bit into the frozen ground, there were men and women who turned away, so no one would see the tears on their faces. There was no celebration. The tank was loaded onto a rail car within hours, bound westward toward a front that was bleeding and desperate. More had to follow. Dozens, hundreds, thousands. The impossible quota loomed like a wall. But for the first time since leaving Kharkov, Ivan allowed himself a single, dangerous thought. Maybe this could work. As the winter of 1941 closed in around Nizhny Tagil, Factory No. 183 was no longer just a collection of refugees and machines. It was becoming a weapon, forged in cold, hunger, and the unrelenting demand to keep the Red Army alive. The 6th of December, 1941, Nizhny Tagil, Sverdlovsk Oblast. The engine backfired once, then caught, its roar cutting through the frozen dawn like a challenge hurled at the sky. Ivan Sokolov stood beside the test track with his collar pulled high, watching exhaust bloom white against the black iron clouds overhead. Somewhere far to the west, the Red Army was launching a counter-offensive outside Moscow. Here, in the Urals, the response took the form of a single word, passed down from Moscow to the shop floor, without decoration or apology. More. Winter crushed Nizhny Tagil with a weight no one pretended to be ready for. -40°C became routine, the kind of cold that killed carelessness in minutes. Inside the factory halls, it was only marginally better. Ice crept across concrete floors. Condensation froze on steel beams and fell in shards when struck by vibration. Workers wrapped rags around tools to keep bare hands from sticking to metal. Even breathing felt like work. The factory never slept. Shifts blurred into one another until time lost meaning. 12 hours became 14. Then 16. Men and women collapsed where they stood, roused by foremen or comrades, shoved back into motion. Sleep came in fragments, stolen on benches or beside warm engine blocks during brief pauses. Ivan learned to rest his eyes while standing, his hands still moving by memory. The workforce changed as the weeks passed. Experienced machinists were pulled away to fix bottlenecks, replaced by teenagers and elderly men. Mistakes were inevitable. Fingers were lost. Burns were common. When accidents happened, there was no ceremony. The injured were carried away. The line adjusted. Production resumed. The tanks could not wait. Chief Engineer Morozov pushed simplification to its limit. Components were standardized aggressively. Non-essential features were eliminated. Interior finishes were abandoned entirely. The T-34 emerging from Nizhny Tagil was becoming cruder in appearance, but faster to build and no less deadly. It was a machine shaped as much by frost and fatigue as by blueprints. Rumors from the front flowed through the plant like an undercurrent. Each story was seized upon, exaggerated, argued over during brief meals. When news came that Moscow had not fallen, that the Germans were retreating, the reaction was not cheering but grim satisfaction. It meant the tanks were buying time. It meant the work mattered. Rail lines became lifelines and targets. Though German bombers could not reach Nizhny Tagil, supply routes were constantly threatened farther west. Steel shipments arrived late or not at all. Bearings and optics became scarce. When proper materials ran out, substitutes were found. If a part could be made from a different alloy, it was. If not, it was redesigned or eliminated. Ivan watched engineers argue fiercely, then compromise in minutes. There was no room for pride. Women took on roles no one would have imagined before the war. They operated heavy machinery, led teams, made decisions that affected entire production runs. Anna Sokolova found herself assigned to quality inspection, crawling inside hulls with a flashlight, checking weld seams with numb fingers. She came home smelling of oil and smoke, her hair stiff with frost. They spoke little at night, conserving energy, sharing bread and silence. The cold claimed its own casualties. Pneumonia spread. Frostbite took toes and fingers. Some workers simply did not wake up. Their bunks were emptied quietly, reassigned by morning. The dead were mourned briefly, then absorbed into the rhythm of necessity. There was no time to stop. The front did not stop. By January 1942, output climbed despite everything. The numbers posted on chalkboards crept upward, each digit a small victory wrestled from exhaustion. 12 tanks in a day. Then 15. Then more. The assembly lines found a brutal efficiency. Mistakes anticipated, delays smoothed by sheer repetition. Ivan could now assemble his section almost blindfolded, his body moving ahead of thought. Testing was merciless. Engines were run hard in the cold. Transmissions stressed until they failed or proved themselves. Tanks that broke down were stripped for parts, or fixed and sent again. There was no notion of perfection, only adequacy. A tank that reached the front and fought even one battle was considered a success. Letters arrived sporadically from soldiers at the front. Some were addressed simply to tank builders, Nizhny Tagil. They spoke of machines that started in impossible cold, of armor that deflected shells, of tracks that carried men through snow and mud alike. These letters were read aloud in workshops, pinned to walls, passed hand to hand until the paper fell apart. They were proof that the steel lives mattered. Ivan read one such letter during a brief break, his hands shaking from cold and fatigue. The writer was a junior lieutenant, his unit unnamed. He thanked the factory workers for the tank that had saved his crew when a German shell glanced off the glacis plate. "We trust your work," the letter said simply. Ivan folded it carefully and placed it inside his coat, close to his chest. Outside, the snow never stopped. It piled against the factory walls, against the rail cars waiting to carry finished tanks west. Locomotives steamed like beasts in the cold, their whistles echoing across the yard. Each departing train was watched until it vanished into the trees, carrying with it weeks of labor and the fragile hope that it would arrive intact. The winter ground on, unrelenting. Yet within the frozen halls of Factory No. 183, something hardened alongside the steel. A rhythm. A belief that endurance itself was a weapon. The workers no longer spoke of returning home to Kharkov. Home had become the line, the machines, the endless demand to keep producing. As 1942 began, and the worst cold slowly loosened its grip, Ivan realized he could no longer remember what his life had been before the war. There was only the next hull, the next shift, the next train heading west, and the certainty that as long as the factory lived, the Red Army would not fight alone. The 18th of March 1942. Nizhny Tagil, Sverdlovsk Oblast. The hammer missed its mark by a fraction, and the ringing impact sent a jolt of pain up Ivan Sokolov's arm. He sucked in air through clenched teeth, shook out his hand, and struck again without pausing. Around him, the factory floor throbbed with motion, a constant metallic heartbeat that drowned out thought. Spring was arriving somewhere beyond the Urals. But inside Factory No. 183, the season was measured not by weather, but by output. The crisis of survival had passed into something more dangerous: routine. Tanks were coming off the line every day now, their numbers climbing steadily. And with that success came new demands. Orders from Moscow grew sharper, less forgiving. Losses at the front remained staggering. Entire tank brigades were being wiped out in weeks. The response was always the same: build more, build faster. Efficiency became doctrine. Every operation was timed, analyzed, stripped to its essentials. Engineers walked the lines with stopwatches, watching hands, counting steps. If a worker took 2 steps where one would do, the station was rearranged. If a tool was shared between stations, duplicates were improvised. The T-34 itself continued to evolve under pressure. Weld seams were simplified further. Cast turrets replaced welded ones where possible, saving hours of labor. Components were redesigned to be interchangeable. Ivan saw designs change mid-shift, instructions chalked onto steel plates and boards. Learned by repetition rather than explanation. The tank was no longer a fixed object. It was a living thing, adapting to the factory that built it. Training never stopped, even as production ran at full pace. New workers arrived weekly, evacuees, conscripts from technical schools, women from nearby villages. They were thrown into the line with minimal instruction, paired with veterans who taught by example and shouted correction. Ivan found himself mentoring a boy named Sergei, thin as a rail, his hands shaking the first time he touched a welding torch. By the end of the month, Sergei worked with grim focus, his movements steady, his face aged by exhaustion. Quality control walked a fine line between necessity and impossibility. Tanks had to function, but there was no time for exhaustive testing. Failures at the front were reported back in terse summaries. A gearbox jammed under load. A hatch warped in extreme cold. Each report triggered frantic adjustments, small changes rippling through the line. The factory learned from destruction, adapting its output based on wreckage and blood. Food improved slightly as supply lines stabilized. Potatoes appeared more often in soup, occasionally a piece of meat. These small changes were noticed immediately, discussed with the seriousness of strategic decisions. Strength returned slowly, unevenly. Illness declined, but fatigue remained constant, etched into faces and postures. News from the south brought new dread. German forces were advancing again, driving toward the Volga and the Caucasus. Stalingrad became a word spoken with unease. The factory responded instinctively. Shifts lengthened. Rest days vanished. The chalkboard numbers rose again. Ivan stopped counting the days entirely, marking time instead by the serial numbers etched into hulls as they passed his station. Rail traffic intensified. Trains left Nizhny Tagil daily now. Long chains of flat cars carrying green silhouettes under tarps. The men who loaded them worked with a sense of urgency, sharpened by rumor. German aircraft were ranging deeper, supply lines were under threat. Every tank that reached the front was a victory over distance as much as the enemy. Morozov addressed the workforce only once that spring, standing on a crate amid the noise. His voice was hoarse, his words plain. The factory, he said, was now producing more tanks than any other plant in the world. This was not said with pride, but with warning. The enemy knew this. The burden would not lighten. It would grow. Ivan listened without expression. Pride was dangerous. It invited disappointment. He had seen too many things break. Instead, he focused on the next hull, the next sequence of motions. The work had become a kind of armor, insulating him from fear. As long as his hands moved, there was no room for doubt. By early summer, Factory No. 183 had become a system refined by crisis. Machines broke and were repaired. People collapsed and were replaced. The line never stopped. The factory no longer felt temporary or improvised. It was permanent, brutal, and essential. When Ivan stepped outside one evening and felt the faint warmth of the sun on his face, he was surprised to find it unfamiliar. He stood for a moment, eyes closed, listening to the distant rumble of engines being tested. Somewhere, far away, those engines would soon roar in battle. Inside, another hull moved forward. Another turret was lowered into place. Destruction was constant at the front. But here, in this place carved out of mud and frost, the answer was relentless creation. Factory No. 183 had learned how to outrun loss, and it would need every lesson in the months to come. The 3rd of September 1942. Nizhny Tagil, Sverdlovsk Oblast. The radio crackled with static before the voice came through, flat and strained, carrying the weight of a city being torn apart. Ivan Sokolov stood with one boot propped against a crate of bearings, listening as the announcer spoke of fighting street by street along the Volga. Stalingrad. The name settled over the factory floor like a layer of dust that could not be brushed away. Every man and woman there understood what it meant. This was not another retreat. This was a line drawn in blood. Production did not slow. If anything, it accelerated. The orders arriving from Moscow no longer bothered with explanation. Tank brigades were being fed into the ruins as fast as rail lines could carry them. Losses were catastrophic. Machines built in Nizhny Tagil were sometimes destroyed within days of reaching the front. The factory responded the only way it knew how, by replacing them before the smoke cleared. The summer had been short and deceptive. Now autumn crept in, bringing rain that turned yards into mud and seeped into everything. Tracks were tested in slop as thick as porridge. Engines run hard to simulate the strain of urban combat. Tanks rolled out coated in grime almost as soon as they were painted, as if already returning from battle. Ivan watched them go with a detached familiarity, noting serial numbers out of habit rather than hope. Workers spoke of Stalingrad in fragments. A cousin trapped on the west bank. A neighbor's son missing after a counterattack. Letters stopped arriving from the south, replaced by official notices delivered with practiced stiffness. Grief was compressed, folded into routine. The factory itself changed again under the pressure. Lights blazing against the darkness, visible for kilometers despite blackout precautions. Security patrols doubled, rifles slung over shoulders as they circled the perimeter. Though the Luftwaffe could not reach Nizhny Tagil, sabotage was feared. A single fire, a single act of destruction could cripple production. Trust became cautious, watchful. Material shortages worsened. Optics were scarce, forcing crews at the front to fight with limited visibility. Rubber for road wheels ran short. Steel quality fluctuated as different sources were tapped. Engineers compensated constantly, adjusting heat treatments, changing suppliers, improvising solutions that would have been unthinkable before the war. Ivan learned to feel flaws through gloves, to sense when metal would fail before it did. Despite everything, output climbed. Factory No. 183 became the heart of Soviet tank production, its numbers dominating reports sent to the Kremlin. With that prominence came scrutiny. Inspectors arrived frequently, notebooks in hand, faces expressionless. Failures were noted, delays questioned. The margin for error narrowed to nothing. One evening, as Ivan helped Sergei guide a turret into place, the ground seemed to tremble faintly underfoot, not from bombs, but from the simultaneous roar of dozens of engines being tested. The sound rolled across the yard and into the forest beyond, a mechanical thunder meant for the steppes and ruined cities of the West. Sergei paused, listening, his face unreadable. He was 17 now, his childhood gone as completely as any building in Stalingrad. When news finally came that Soviet forces had encircled the German Sixth Army, then confirmation followed. The factory absorbed the news with a collective exhale, not celebration. Encirclement meant time. Time meant tanks could arrive in strength. Time meant the dead might not be in vain. Ivan returned to his station with renewed focus, his hands steady despite the fatigue that never truly left him. The tanks rolling out now would be part of something larger than survival. They would carry the war back west. As autumn deepened and the fate of Stalingrad hung in the balance, Factory No. 183 worked without pause, its furnaces glowing through the night. Far from the ruins on the Volga, another front raged here, measured in hours saved, parts completed, trains dispatched, and in that relentless rhythm, the Urals answered the call of a city fighting for its life. The 3rd of February 1943. Nizhny Tagil, Sverdlovsk Oblast. The announcement came just before dawn, read aloud over the factory loudspeakers with no fanfare, as if it were simply another production target met. The German Sixth Army at Stalingrad had surrendered. Ivan Sokolov paused with his hands resting on a cooling weld seam, the words echoing inside his skull long after the speaker fell silent. Around him, the factory did not stop. Machines kept turning. Hammers kept falling. Victory, when it came, was absorbed into the noise. There were moments of acknowledgement, quick embraces, nods exchanged between exhausted faces, but no celebration. Everyone understood what surrender meant and what it did not. The enemy was broken in one place, but the war was far from over. Losses had been immense. Entire Soviet tank armies had been consumed in the fighting. The demand for replacement vehicles remained relentless. Winter returned with familiar cruelty. Snow drifted against the factory walls, and the cold crept back into joints and lungs. The difference now was experience. Workers knew how to fight it. Lines were shielded better. Fires were placed with intention. Procedures for cold starts and frozen components were refined. What had once been chaos was now grim competence. The T-34 continued its evolution, informed by hard lessons from the front. Reports from Stalingrad spoke of close-quarters fighting, of tanks used as mobile bunkers, of shells fired at point-blank range. Armor fittings were reinforced where possible. Spare track links were mounted on hulls, not just for repair, but as improvised armor. Small changes, but ones that reflected the dialogue between factory and battlefield. Ivan received a letter that winter, forwarded through a chain of addresses and military offices. It was from his cousin Nikolai, a tank commander he had not heard from in over a year. The letter was short, written in a cramped hand, stained with something dark. Nikolai wrote of fighting through rubble, of the heat inside the tank even in winter, of trusting the engine and armor without question. "If your hands touched this machine," he wrote, "then I owe you my life." Ivan folded the letter carefully and said nothing to anyone. Production quotas rose again. The victory at Stalingrad did not ease the pressure. it intensified it. The Red Army was preparing to seize the initiative. New offensives were planned across the southern front. Tanks would lead the way. Factory. No. 183 was expected to provide them in numbers that would overwhelm the enemy by sheer mass. The workforce felt the strain. Those who had survived the worst years now carried a deeper fatigue, less visible but more dangerous. Accidents increased slightly as concentration wavered. Foremen rotated tasks when they could, forcing rest in small doses. There was talk of medals, of recognition, but such things felt abstract, almost irrelevant. What mattered was the next shift, the next train. Inspectors from Moscow arrived with renewed intensity. They walked the lines, questioned engineers, demanded explanations for every deviation. Morozov defended his designs fiercely, arguing for the balance between speed and reliability. He won some battles, lost others. Changes were implemented overnight, sometimes reversed just as quickly. The factory adapted, as it always had. Outside, the yard filled with finished tanks awaiting shipment. Their silhouettes stood stark against the snow, rows upon rows of sloped armor and long guns pointed nowhere. Ivan often found his gaze drawn to them during brief pauses, imagining the crews that would soon occupy those cramped interiors. He wondered how many would survive their first engagement, how many would not. By spring, rumors of a great German offensive began to circulate. Intelligence suggested the enemy was preparing a massive armored strike to regain the initiative. The name Kursk began to appear in conversations, maps tacked to walls in planning offices. Everyone understood what it implied. The largest tank battle in history was coming. The response was immediate. Production surged. Shifts were extended again. Stockpiles were built where possible. Every tank completed felt like a piece placed on a board whose shape no one could fully see. The factory braced itself for the storm it knew was coming. On the morning, Ivan watched another train depart, its load heavier than most. He felt a strange calm. There was only work, and the knowledge that this work would soon be tested on a scale never seen before. Stalingrad had been a turning point, but it was not the end. 183. It was a promise that endurance could become momentum, and that the steel they forged would soon decide the fate of entire armies. The 12th of June, 1943. Nizhny Tagil, Sverdlovsk Oblast. The smell of hot oil and ozone hung heavy in the air as Ivan Sokolov leaned into the wrench, muscles burning as he tightened the final bolts on a transmission housing. Somewhere down the line, a whistle blew, signaling another completed hull moving forward. Outside, summer had finally reached the Urals, but inside Factory No. 183, the heat came not from the sun, but from furnaces pushed beyond their intended limits. Kursk was coming, and everyone knew it. The word had stopped being a rumor. Maps were now posted openly in engineering offices, red and blue arrows marking the bulge in the front line that would soon erupt. German forces were massing armor in unprecedented numbers, including new machines whispered about with a mix of dread and curiosity. Tigers, Panthers, heavier and more powerful than anything the Red Army had faced before. The response from Moscow was unequivocal. Overwhelm them, drown them in steel. Production targets climbed to heights that would have been unimaginable 2 years earlier. Factory No. 183 was expected to deliver tanks not just steadily, but in waves, timed to the opening phases of the coming battle. Every delay was treated as a potential disaster. Meetings were short and tense. Decisions were made quickly and rarely revisited. The T-34, 76 rolling off the lines in mid-1943, bore the marks of relentless refinement. Welds were rough, but strong. Components were standardized to the point that entire subassemblies could be swapped in minutes. Crews at the front demanded reliability above all else. The tanks might face enemies with thicker armor and longer guns, but they would not fail to start, not fail to move, not fail to fight. Ivan worked now as part of a specialized team assigned to final drive assemblies, one of the most failure-prone components under combat stress. The work required precision even under crushing speed. Mistakes here meant immobilized tanks, targets waiting to be destroyed. His team operated with near-silent coordination, each man anticipating the other's movements, correcting errors before they became problems. Training intensified alongside production. Crews bound for the front began appearing at the factory. Gaunt young men in dusty uniforms, their faces marked by anticipation and fear. They walked among the machines, listening as engineers explained quirks and shortcuts, learning how to coax the most from engines pushed to their limits. He had built the machines they would trust with their lives, but he would never meet most of them again. Security tightened further. Guards checked papers obsessively. Lights were shielded at night despite the remoteness of the Urals. Rumors of German agents circulated, though none were ever confirmed. The idea that the enemy might reach this far, might disrupt the flow of tanks before Kursk, was enough to keep everyone alert. The pace took its toll. Accidents rose again. A press malfunctioned one afternoon, crushing a worker's hand beyond saving. The line halted for less than an hour before resuming. The injured man was gone by evening, his station filled the next morning by someone else. Ivan felt the familiar dull ache in his chest, a mix of anger and resignation that had no outlet. Morozov pushed the design teams relentlessly. Feedback from test ranges was incorporated almost immediately. Armor angles were adjusted by degrees that mattered in deflection. Mountings were reinforced where German shells were most likely to strike. Even small improvements, multiplied across hundreds of tanks, could tilt the balance. The factory worked not in isolation, but in constant conversation with intelligence reports and battlefield experience. As June wore on, trains departed almost continuously. The rail yard was a maze of flat cars and steam, crews shouting over the din as they secured loads. Ivan often found himself watching the last car disappear around the bend, imagining the journey west through forests, across rivers, toward a battlefield already being prepared with mines, trenches, and expectations of unprecedented violence. Letters from the front took on a new tone. There was confidence now, cautious but real. Crews spoke of layered defenses, of coordination between infantry, artillery, and armor. They asked for more tanks, always more. But their words carried belief as well as need. The Red Army was no longer reacting. It was planning. One evening, as Ivan and Anna walked back to their barracks under a sky still bright with lingering daylight, the distant rumble of engines testing echoed across the fields. Anna listened for a moment, then said quietly that the sound no longer frightened her. It felt like assurance. Ivan did not answer, but he understood. The factory's noise had become a promise. By the end of June, the pace reached a peak that felt unsustainable. Shifts blurred again. Sleep shortened. Tempers frayed. Yet the line held. When the final quotas for the Kursk buildup were met, there was no announcement, no pause. Production continued without interruption, feeding reserves, anticipating losses that had not yet occurred. On the eve of the battle, as the first reports of artillery exchanges filtered back, Ivan stood beside a completed T-34. Its paint still fresh, its metal warm. He ran a gloved hand along the sloped armor, feeling the imperfections he knew so well. Somewhere soon, shells would strike this surface, crews would shout inside, engines would strain. The factory had done what it could. It had turned time, labor, and human endurance into an arsenal. Now the outcome would be decided far from Nizhny Tagil, in fields and villages that would soon be ground into history. As the summer night settled over the Urals, Factory No. 183 kept working, its answer to the coming storm already rolling west on steel tracks. The 7th of July, 1943. Nizhny Tagil, Sverdlovsk Oblast. The first reports from the front arrived before sunrise, carried by teleprinter and read aloud by a clerk, whose hands shook despite his effort to sound steady. Even Sokolov was already at his station, tightening bolts by the light of hanging lamps, When the words filtered across the factory floor, massive armored engagements, sustained air attacks, losses on both sides measured in the hundreds. Kursk was no longer a future event. It was happening now. The reaction inside Factory No. 183 was immediate and instinctive. No orders were needed. Shifts stretched without discussion. Breaks vanished. Foremen stopped pretending there was a schedule beyond endurance. Every man and woman understood that the tanks leaving Nizhny Tagil now were not reserves, they were replacements for machines already burning on the steppe. The heat inside the factory became oppressive. Summer in the Urals brought no mercy. And with furnaces running constantly, the air grew thick and metallic. Sweat-streaked faces already blackened with grime. Shirts were discarded. Hands blistered and split, then wrapped and used anyway. Ivan worked with a dull roar in his ears. The combined sound of presses, welders, and engines bleeding into a single, relentless note. Details from the battle came in fragments. German Panthers breaking down before reaching the fight. Tigers advancing under artillery fire. Soviet defenses layered with mines and anti-tank guns. T-34 seconds charging forward in waves. Some knocked out within minutes. Others pushing through to close range where their mobility and numbers mattered most. Each scrap of information was seized upon, analyzed, argued over, in shouted exchanges between tasks. Failures were tracked obsessively. When a report mentioned a final drive failure under sustained maneuvering, Ivan's team felt it like a personal wound. Adjustments were made immediately, reinforcements here, tolerances tightened there without waiting for formal approval. The factory operated on intuition honed by years of crisis. There was no time for paperwork. The rail yard became a place of constant motion. Trains were loaded day and night. Steam and diesel exhaust mixing in the warm air. Crews worked under floodlights, shouting to be heard, their movements quick and practiced. Tanks were chained down and covered, though everyone knew concealment was symbolic at best. The urgency was not secrecy, but speed. Inside the workshops, the presence of frontline crews increased. Units rotated back briefly for refitting or to receive replacements. Their uniforms dusted with the pale soil of the Kursk salient. They spoke quietly, with the flat tone of men who had seen too much too fast. Ivan listened when he could, absorbing details about how the tanks behaved under fire, how engines responded when pushed hard through cratered ground. These conversations fed directly back into the work, closing the loop between factory and battlefield. One afternoon, a young sergeant stood watching as a tank underwent final testing, its engine screaming at full throttle. He nodded slowly, then said that his last machine had taken 3 hits before stopping. Not destroyed, just immobilized. He hoped the next one would last longer. Ivan met his eyes briefly, then returned to his work. There were no words that fit. As the battle raged on, the scale of it became clear even from thousands of kilometers away. Loss figures rose, then stabilized, then rose again. Yet something else appeared in the reports as well. German momentum faltering, attacks stalling, counterblows forming. The Red Army was holding, then pushing back. The machines built in Nizhny Tagil were not just being consumed, they were changing the shape of the fight. The strain on the workforce reached a breaking point for some. A woman collapsed beside a press and did not get up. She was carried out, her face gray, her pulse weak. The line paused briefly, then resumed. Ivan felt a flash of anger at the cruelty of it, then buried it under motion. Emotion was a luxury that cost time. Morozov moved constantly through the factory, his presence both reassuring and demanding. Finish did not stop shells, he reminded them. Availability did. The argument always ended the same way. The line kept moving. When the first clear confirmation arrived that the German offensive had failed, it came quietly, almost cautiously. The enemy had been stopped. Counter-offensives were underway. Orel and Belgorod were threatened. The reaction inside Factory No. 183 was not jubilation, but a subtle shift in posture, a collective straightening of backs. The tanks had done their work. Now they would do more. Production did not ease. If anything, it intensified again. Success created opportunity, and opportunity demanded exploitation. New offensives required fresh armor. Losses still had to be replaced. The factory pivoted seamlessly from emergency response to sustained pressure, its output now part of a larger, grinding advance westward. Ivan realized one evening, as he watched another train depart, that the fear he had once associated with news from the front had changed shape. It was no longer fear of collapse, of annihilation. It was fear of delay, of failing to keep pace with a war that was finally moving in their favor. Victory, he understood, was not a moment. It was a process that demanded constant feeding. Kursk burned for weeks. And through it all, Factory No. 183 never fell silent. The battle was fought in fields torn apart by shells and tracks, but it was sustained here, in heat and noise and exhaustion. Each tank that left carried with it not just steel and fuel, but the accumulated endurance of thousands who would never see the battlefield. When the reports finally shifted decisively toward Soviet advance, Ivan did not stop working. None of them did. There would be time later, perhaps, to understand what Kursk had meant. For now, the only truth that mattered was this. The factory had met the fire with motion, and the motion had not broken. The 7th of July, 1943. Nizhny Tagil, Sverdlovsk Oblast. The first reports from the front arrived before sunrise, carried by teleprinter and read aloud by a clerk whose hands shook despite his effort to sound steady. Ivan Sokolov was already at his station, tightening bolts by the light of hanging lamps, when the words filtered across the factory floor. Massive armored engagements, sustained air attacks, losses on both sides measured in the hundreds. Kursk was no longer a future event. It was happening now. The reaction inside Factory No. 183 was immediate and instinctive. No orders were needed. Shifts stretched without discussion. Breaks vanished. Foremen stopped pretending there was a schedule beyond endurance. Every man and woman understood that the tanks leaving Nizhny Tagil now were not reserves. They were replacements for machines already burning on the steppe. The heat inside the factory became oppressive. Summer in the Urals brought no mercy, and with furnaces running constantly, the air grew thick and metallic. Sweat-streaked faces already blackened with grime. Shirts were discarded, hands blistered and split, then wrapped and used anyway. Ivan worked with a dull roar in his ears, the combined sound of presses, welders, and engines bleeding into a single, relentless note. Details from the battle came in fragments. German Panthers breaking down before reaching the fight. Tigers advancing under artillery fire. Soviet defenses layered with mines and anti-tank guns. T-34 seconds charging forward in waves. Some knocked out within minutes. Others pushing through to close range where their mobility and numbers mattered most. Each scrap of information was seized upon, analyzed, argued over in shouted exchanges between tasks. Failures were tracked obsessively. When a report mentioned a final drive failure under sustained maneuvering, Ivan's team felt it like a personal wound. Adjustments were made immediately, reinforcements here, tolerances tightened there, without waiting for formal approval. The factory operated on intuition honed by years of crisis. There was no time for paperwork. The rail yard became a place of constant motion. Trains were loaded day and night, steam and diesel exhaust mixing in the warm air. Crews worked under floodlights, shouting to be heard, their movements quick and practiced. Tanks were chained down and covered, though everyone knew concealment was symbolic at best. The urgency was not secrecy, but speed. Inside the workshops, the presence of frontline crews increased. Units rotated back briefly for refitting or to receive replacements. Their uniforms dusted with the pale soil of the Kursk salient. They spoke quietly, with the flat tone of men who had seen too much too fast. Ivan listened when he could, absorbing details about how the tanks behaved under fire, how engines responded when pushed hard through cratered ground. These conversations fed directly back into the work, closing the loop between factory and battlefield. One afternoon, A young sergeant stood watching as a tank underwent final testing, its engine screaming at full throttle. He nodded slowly, then said that his last machine had taken 3 hits before stopping. Not destroyed, just immobilized. He hoped the next one would last longer. Ivan met his eyes briefly, then returned to his work. There were no words that fit. As the battle raged on, the scale of it became clear, even from thousands of kilometers away. Loss figures rose, then stabilized, then rose again. Yet something else appeared in the reports as well. German momentum faltering, attacks stalling, counterblows forming. The Red Army was holding, then pushing back. The machines built in Nizhny Tagil were not just being consumed, they were changing the shape of the fight. The strain on the workforce reached a breaking point for some. A woman collapsed beside a press and did not get up. She was carried out, her face gray, her pulse weak. The line paused briefly, then resumed. Ivan felt a flash of anger at the cruelty of it, then buried it under motion. Emotion was a luxury that cost time. Morozov moved constantly through the factory, his presence both reassuring and demanding. He listened to reports, made decisions, argued with inspectors who suggested slowing output to improve finish. Finish did not stop shells, he reminded them. Availability did. The argument always ended the same way. The line kept moving. When the first clear confirmation arrived that the German offensive had failed, it came quietly, almost cautiously. Orel and Belgorod were threatened. The reaction inside Factory No. 183 was not jubilation, but a subtle shift in posture, a collective straightening of backs. The tanks had done their work. Now they would do more. Production did not ease. If anything, it intensified again. Success created opportunity, and opportunity demanded exploitation. New offensives required fresh armor. Losses still had to be replaced. The factory pivoted seamlessly from emergency response to sustained pressure, its output now part of a larger, grinding advance westward. Ivan realized one evening, as he watched another train depart, that the fear he had once associated with news from the front had changed shape. It was no longer fear of collapse, of annihilation. It was fear of delay, of failing to keep pace with a war that was finally moving in their favor. Victory, he understood, was not a moment. It was a process that demanded constant feeding. Kursk burned for weeks. And through it all, Factory No. 183 never fell silent. The battle was fought in fields torn apart by shells and tracks, but it was sustained here, in heat and noise and exhaustion. Each tank that left carried with it not just steel and fuel, but the accumulated endurance of thousands who would never see the battlefield. When the reports finally shifted decisively toward Soviet advance, Ivan did not stop working. None of them did. There would be time later, perhaps, to understand what Kursk had meant. For now, the only truth that mattered was this. The factory had met the fire with motion, and the motion had not broken. The 21st of September, 1943, Nizhny Tagil, Sverdlovsk Oblast. The morning air carried a hint of autumn again, cooler now, cleaner. As Ivan Sokolov stepped out of the assembly hall and paused beside the rail spur, a line of freshly completed T-34 seconds waited under canvas covers, their tracks resting on wooden blocks, engines still ticking faintly as they cooled. Beyond the yard, leaves were beginning to yellow along the forest edge. Far to the west, the front was moving this time, not toward them, but away. The reports arriving from headquarters had changed in tone since Kursk. Kharkov, spoken of again, this time as a place reclaimed rather than abandoned. The sense of emergency that had dominated every decision for 2 years did not disappear, but it transformed. Now the factory was feeding an advance, not plugging a collapse. The work remained brutal, but its purpose felt steadier, more assured. Production schedules were reorganized to support sustained operations. Instead of frantic replacement for catastrophic losses, planners demanded consistency streams of tanks delivered on predictable timetables to support coordinated offensives. Factory No. 183 adapted without ceremony. The same methods refined under crisis were now applied with ruthless regularity. Output stabilized at levels once thought impossible. Ivan noticed the change most clearly in the rail yard. Trains still departed daily, but the atmosphere around them was different. Loading crews worked with practiced calm rather than frantic urgency. Officers overseeing shipments spoke in measured tones. There was still pressure, always pressure, but less panic. Design changes continued, driven by feedback from advancing units. Crews reported fighting across rivers, through ruined infrastructure, over ground churned into mud by retreating enemy forces. In response, transmission seals were improved against water ingress. Air filters were modified to cope with dust and debris. Small field modifications tested at the front were incorporated back at the factory within weeks. The dialogue between combat and production had become seamless. New workers still arrived, but now they were trained more systematically. Experienced hands like Ivan were formally designated as instructors for portions of each shift, expected to teach even as they produced. It slowed the line slightly at first, then paid dividends as mistakes dropped and confidence rose. The factory was no longer just surviving, it was institutionalizing what it had learned. The human cost remained visible. Faces were gaunt. Bodies bore scars from accidents and overwork. Yet there was a subtle change in posture, in the way people spoke about the future. Conversations occasionally drifted beyond the next shift, the next quota. Someone mentioned rebuilding. Another spoke of returning west someday, of seeing what remained of their old homes. Such talk was brief, cautious, but it existed. One afternoon, a group of tank crews arrived fresh from the front, their machines battered but intact. They stood beside the line, pointing out scars, explaining how sloped armor had deflected shells, how engines had kept running despite damage. Ivan ran his hand over a gouge in a glacis plate, imagining the moment of impact. The tank had survived. The crew had survived. That was enough. Morozov convened a short meeting with senior engineers that week, not to demand more speed, but to discuss sustainability. Workers needed rest, at least in rotation. The factory's greatest enemy now was not sudden collapse, but exhaustion. Some shifts were shortened slightly, others rotated. It was not generosity, it was strategy. The war would not end quickly. As autumn deepened, the Urals prepared again for winter. Fuel stocks were built up. Insulation improved where possible. Lessons from previous winters were applied methodically. There was confidence now that the factory could endure whatever cold came, just as it had endured bombs, shortages, and fear. Ivan found himself thinking of Kharkov more often. News confirmed it had been liberated, though much of it lay in ruins. The thought stirred conflicting emotions, relief, grief, anger. He wondered if his old workshop still stood, if the marks he had left on the floor were still there under rubble and dust. He did not dwell on it long. There was work to do. The tanks rolling out of Nizhny Tagil in late 1943 were not symbols of desperation. They were instruments of pressure, driving the enemy back step by step. Each one represented not just survival, but accumulation, the compounded effort of years under strain finally pushing outward. As Ivan returned to the line, the familiar rhythm took hold again. Another hull advanced. Another turret descended. The sound was the same as it had always been, but its meaning had changed. The war was still far from over, but Factory No. 183 now worked with the knowledge that the impossible it had once been asked to do had become routine, and that routine was carrying the Red Army west. The 14th of January 1944. Nizhny Tagil, Sverdlovsk Oblast. The factory whistle cut through the darkness before dawn. Its sound sharp and familiar, echoing across snow-covered yards and barracks, roofs bowed under white weight. Ivan Sokolov pulled on his coat with stiff fingers and stepped outside, his boots crunching on packed ice. The cold was deep again, but it no longer carried the same menace it once had. Winter had become an adversary they understood. Inside Factory No. 183. The lights were already burning, reflecting off steel and frost in equal measure. The line was in motion before most of the city stirred. Tanks moved forward in steady procession, their forms now instantly recognizable to anyone who had spent time here. What had once felt miraculous continuous production at this scale had become expected. The Red Army was advancing on multiple fronts now, pushing toward the Dnieper and beyond. With each successful operation came new demands. Success, Ivan learned, was heavy. Victories consumed equipment as relentlessly as defeats, sometimes more so. Offensive warfare devoured tanks through breakdowns, mechanical wear, and combat losses that came not from desperation but from momentum. The factory adapted its rhythm again. Output remained high, but emphasis shifted subtly toward durability. Tanks needed to survive long marches, constant movement, and rapid redeployment. Engineers analyzed reports describing transmissions worn down by weeks of advance, engines clogged with dust and debris from destroyed infrastructure. Solutions were incremental, stronger seals, revised maintenance intervals, but they mattered. Ivan's station now included brief inspections of components already assembled, a redundancy added after reports of field failures traced back to fatigue rather than flaw. He welcomed the change. It demanded focus rather than speed alone, and in that focus he found a kind of grim satisfaction. The war had taught him that haste and carelessness were not opposites, but partners that had to be balanced. The workforce continued to age in strange ways. Young workers grew older before their time, while older ones seemed to harden, their movements slower but precise. There were fewer new faces now. Evacuation had slowed, and the factory relied increasingly on those who had survived its worst years. Bonds formed quietly, through shared endurance rather than conversation. Anna still worked inspection, her hair now threaded with gray she did not bother to hide. They spoke more in the evenings than they once had, though their conversations were subdued. Sometimes they talked about after the word used without detail, a placeholder for a future neither dared to define too clearly. Other nights, they said nothing, content to sit in shared silence. The factory received visitors more frequently now, delegations from Moscow and from Allied missions, officers and officials eager to witness the engine of production that had become legendary. Asked questions, took notes. Ivan barely noticed them. What mattered was not who watched, but whether the tanks arrived where they were needed. News from the front grew steadily more encouraging. Cities were liberated in rapid succession. German forces retreated, sometimes fighting stubbornly, sometimes collapsing under pressure. The sense of inevitability grew, not that victory was assured tomorrow, but that the arc of the war had bent decisively. The factory felt it in the cadence of orders, in the confidence of planning weeks and months ahead. Yet loss remained constant. Notices still arrived. Names were read quietly. Even in victory, the cost was relentless. Ivan learned that Nikolai, his cousin, had been wounded near the Dnieper, his tank disabled by artillery fire. He survived, evacuated east. The news brought relief, tangled with guilt. Survival felt arbitrary, undeserved. As winter deepened, the factory ran without interruption. Snow piled against the walls again, but this time there was fuel, insulation, experience. Workers rotated to prevent collapse. Machines were maintained proactively. The chaos of earlier winters had been replaced by harsh order. It was not kinder, but it was sustainable. One evening, Ivan stood near the test track as a completed tank roared forward, its engine strong and steady. The sound no longer filled him with dread or awe. It felt like confirmation, a continuation of something set in motion years before. He realized then that the factory itself had become a kind of front one that advanced not by kilometers, but by consistency. Factory No. 183 no longer chased impossibility. It carried the weight of what it had already achieved, and that weight demanded endurance of a different kind. The war was turning, but it was not done with them yet. As Ivan returned to his station, the line moved on, unbroken. Steel flowed forward, shaped by hands that had learned to endure both failure and success. The impossible had become normal, and normal, now, was what would win the war. The 6th of June 1944. Nizhny Tagil, Sverdlovsk Oblast. The summer light lingered late into the evening, painting the factory yard in pale gold as Ivan Sokolov wiped grease from his hands and leaned against a crate of spare road wheels. The air was warm, heavy with the smell of oil and dust. Somewhere beyond the Urals, the war was accelerating toward its climax, and for the first time since 1941, the end no longer felt like an abstraction. News traveled fast that day, carried by radio and confirmed by hurried conversations among engineers and foremen. Allied forces had landed in France. A second front was open. The announcement rippled through Factory No. 183. Not as celebration, but as calculation. Another front meant pressure eased here, another weight placed on the enemy. It meant the work mattered in a broader, undeniable way. Production continued at a relentless but measured pace. The factory now operated with an almost industrial serenity, its systems refined through years of crisis. Breakdowns were rare, addressed quickly. Supply chains, once fragile, now held firm. Steel arrived on time. Components were stocked in depth. The chaos of evacuation and improvisation had given way to something approaching stability. Though no one dared call it comfort, the tanks themselves bore witness to this maturation. Subtle refinements accumulated into reliability. Assembly times shortened without sacrificing function. Crews reported machines capable of weeks of continuous operation. Engines that could be coaxed back to life after abuse that would have crippled earlier models. The dialogue between front and factory had become fluent, almost instinctive. Ivan's role shifted again, less physical now, more supervisory. He still worked with his hands, but he also watched others, corrected technique, passed on habits learned through hardship. He saw himself in the younger workers, though their war was already different. They had not known the panic of 1941, the hunger of that first winter. Their fatigue was real, but it lacked the sharp edge of uncertainty that had once haunted every shift. Conversations turned increasingly toward the future. Not plans, no one trusted plans, but possibilities. Returning west. Rebuilding cities. What kind of country would emerge from this devastation? These talks were brief and cautious, often ending in silence as if acknowledging the danger of hope spoken too loudly. Morozov, grayer now, less frenetic but no less intense, addressed the workforce in small groups rather than grand speeches. He spoke of maintaining standards, of not letting confidence become complacency. The war would not forgive mistakes made out of optimism. The line kept moving. Losses continued, though now they came wrapped in reports of advances. The Red Army pushed through Belarus, toward Poland. Names of foreign cities appeared on maps pinned to office walls. The distance from Nizhny Tagil to the front grew steadily, a measure not of safety, but of progress. The factory's influence stretched farther than ever. Ivan received word that Nikolai was recovering in a hospital east of the Volga. There was talk he might not return to combat. The news brought a complicated relief, tinged with the knowledge that others would take his place. As summer deepened, the factory prepared for what many believed would be the final year of fighting. The urgency remained, but it was purposeful rather than frantic. The question was no longer whether they could meet demands, but how long those demands would last. One evening, Ivan and Anna walked the length of the yard, watching workers load another train. The process was smooth, almost elegant. Chains clinked into place. Engines were secured. The locomotive hissed, ready. Anna said quietly that she sometimes forgot how impossible all this had once seemed. Ivan nodded, though he had not forgotten. He carried the memory of mud, frost, and fear too deeply for that. When the train finally pulled away, its cars disappearing into the trees, Ivan felt a familiar mix of release and obligation. Another delivery complete. Another promise kept. Somewhere ahead, men would climb into those machines, trusting that they would work when needed. As the sun dipped low and the yard lights flickered on, Factory No. 183 settled back into its rhythm. The war was not over, but its shape was clear now. The long road that had begun in panic and retreat was narrowing toward an end. And until that end came, the factory would do what it had learned to do better than anyone else: keep building, keep moving, and never look away from the work. The 27th of January 1945. Nizhny Tagil, Sverdlovsk Oblast. The cold returned once more, sharp and familiar, scraping against lungs and skin as Ivan Sokolov crossed the yard before dawn. Snow creaked underfoot, the sound swallowed by the low thunder of engines warming inside the assembly halls. Winter no longer felt like an enemy. It felt like an old test, one that Factory No. 183 had passed too many times to fear again. The war now was racing toward its end. Inside, the factory moved with a precision that bordered on impersonal. Tanks advanced along the line in a steady procession, their construction almost ritualized. Each station knew its task. Each worker knew the limits of speed and care. The frantic improvisation of earlier years had been replaced by confidence born of survival. This was an enterprise that had learned how not to break. News from the front was astonishing in its scale. Soviet forces had crossed the Vistula. Warsaw was liberated. The Oder River lay ahead. Berlin was no longer a distant name, but a looming objective. The distances spoken of were vast, yet the front seemed closer than ever, pulled westward by momentum that felt unstoppable. The demands on the factory remained severe, but they were different now. Long road marches, rapid redeployment, constant pressure on a retreating enemy. All of it punished machines in ways earlier defensive fighting had not. Factory No. 183 answered with refinements honed by 4 years of attrition. Engines were tested longer, assemblies inspected twice. Field modifications proven in Poland were incorporated almost immediately. Ivan spent more time walking the line than working a single station, his role now firmly that of a senior craftsman. Younger workers deferred to him instinctively. He corrected a misaligned fitting here, a rushed weld there, never raising his voice. There was no need. Everyone understood what was at stake. A tank that failed now might delay an entire column racing toward the heart of the Reich. The human cost lingered quietly. Faces were fewer than before. Some stations stood manned by replacements who would never know the names of those who once worked there. Absences were permanent, woven into the structure of the factory itself. It simply moved past them. Anna's hair was nearly white now, though her movements remained precise. She spoke of retiring from inspection, once the war ended, of hands finally resting. Ivan listened, unsure how to imagine a life not organized by shifts and quotas. The factory had shaped him as thoroughly as he had shaped its machines. Visitors from Moscow came again, this time with a different tone. They spoke of post-war planning, of conversion to peacetime production someday. Rail cars, tractors, reconstruction equipment. The words felt unreal, like a language learned but never used. The line continued uninterrupted. War still demanded attention. Reports arrived describing T-34 seconds rolling through Polish towns, through German villages, engines roaring through streets once considered unreachable. Crews wrote of driving for days without major failure, of machines holding together under relentless use. These letters were no longer read aloud often. They were understood. As January wore on, the factory marked a quiet milestone. Its total production passing numbers that would have seemed absurd in 1941. No ceremony marked it. The tanks kept moving. Achievement, here, was measured only by continuity. One night, Ivan stood near the test track as a tank accelerated into the darkness. He felt no surge of pride, no triumph. The machine would do its job. That was enough. The war was nearing its end, but Factory No. 183 did not slow. Not yet. The final push demanded everything that had been learned. Everything. that had been endured. The last tanks of the war would be built with the same indifference to comfort, the same refusal to fail, as the first. As the winter sky lightened toward morning, Ivan turned back inside. Another hull was waiting. Until the orders stopped, the work would continue. The factory that had been born in flight and frost now drove relentlessly toward a victory it had helped make inevitable. The 9th of May 1945. Nizhny Tagil, Sverdlovsk Oblast. The factory whistle sounded at an unfamiliar hour, long and sustained, cutting through the morning air in a way that made Ivan Sokolov stop mid-step. Around him, men and women froze where they stood on walkways, beside machines, in the yard between buildings. For a brief, dangerous moment, instinct told them something had gone wrong. Then the radios crackled to life, and the words came through clearly, at last. Germany had surrendered. The war in Europe was over. Inside factory, no, 183. The machine slowed, then stopped. Not all at once. Habit was hard to break, but station by station, the noise receded. The great, constant roar that had defined their lives for nearly 4 years ebbed into an unfamiliar quiet. Steam hissed softly. Metal ticked as it cooled. The silence felt heavy, almost intrusive, pressing in on ears long accustomed to chaos. No one cheered immediately. The moment was too large, too sudden. Ivan felt his chest tighten as the meaning settled in, not as triumph, but as release. Around him, faces shifted, some stunned, some hollow, some already wet with tears. A woman sank onto a crate and covered her face with her hands. A man laughed once, sharply, then stopped, as if embarrassed by the sound. Anna found Ivan near the inspection line, her eyes shining, her expression caught between relief and disbelief. They stood together without speaking, listening to the quiet. For the first time since 1941, there was no next quota waiting to be met. No urgent order looming. The factory, which had never truly rested, was holding its breath. Word spread quickly through Nizhny Tagil. People gathered in the yard, in doorways, along the rail spur where so many trains had departed westward under the weight of war. Someone began singing softly, an old song, its words unsteady at first. Others joined in. The sound carried weakly across the open space, swallowed by the vastness of the place they had built. Morozov appeared briefly, standing on the same crate he had used years earlier to demand more speed, more sacrifice. He did not give a speech. He simply nodded once, his face drawn and pale, and said that the work had been done. The factory had fulfilled its duty. There would be time soon to decide what came next. Then he stepped down, and that was all. Ivan walked the length of the assembly hall slowly, his boots echoing on the concrete. Tanks stood at various stages of completion, frozen in mid-creation. Some would never be finished. Others would be completed for peacetime service or storage. He ran a hand along the cold armor of a hull, feeling the familiar roughness of welds laid down in haste and necessity. Each seam carried memory of winter nights, of hunger, of hands numb with cold, but unwilling to stop. He thought of Kharkov, of the day the siren had wailed, not for work, but for war. He thought of the trains, the mud, the frost, the first tank that had rolled out into snow. He thought of Stalingrad, Kursk, the long road west, marked by serial numbers and departure schedules. The factory had not just built tanks, it had measured the war in steel and hours, in human endurance converted into motion. Outside, the yard filled with people. Some embraced. Others stood apart, staring at the sky as if expecting something more to happen. For many, the war had taken so much that victory felt incomplete, almost abstract. Names would not return. Years would not be restored. The factory's silence did not erase the absence left behind. Yet there was something else, too. A quiet understanding of what had been accomplished. Factory No. 183, once uprooted and scattered under bombs, had become the single greatest producer of tanks in the world. Its output had shaped battles, halted advances, and driven an enemy back across a continent. It had done the impossible not once, but every day, under conditions that defied reason. Ivan realized that for the first time in years, he did not feel the urge to hurry. There was nowhere he needed to be immediately, nothing demanding motion. The war that had governed every decision, every breath, had released its grip. What remained was the slow, uncertain work of living with what they had endured. As afternoon light slanted across the factory floor, crews began to tidy stations, not out of urgency, but habit. Tools were set down carefully. Fires were damped. Windows were opened to let in air that did not smell of crisis. Somewhere, a locomotive whistle sounded, not calling tanks to the front, but marking the ordinary passage of time. Ivan and Anna walked out together as evening approached, passing rows of tanks that would never know combat. The forest beyond the yard was green now, alive in a way it had not been for years. Birds moved in the trees, unbothered by the place that had once roared without pause. Behind them, Factory No. 183 stood silent at last, not defeated, not exhausted, but finished with the task history had given it. The war had demanded everything it could take, and the factory had answered without breaking. When the noise finally faded, what remained was proof not just of industrial might, but of human endurance, forged under bombs, hunger, and cold, and carried all the way to victory.